Amid the sea of apathy in which Americans are adrift, there are ripples of discontent. With organization and focus, they can become tidal waves. Otherwise, they'll meekly dissipate. Two examples of such ripples with unrealized potential are Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party. Occupy was fueled by vast public resentment of the incestuous relationship between politicos and big business, which the 2008 economic disaster exposed. Incestuous because they both belong to the same family of oligarchs that control the country. Their members exchange positions frequently and easily. Goldman Sachs executives become Treasury secretaries, and Treasury secretaries become executives of Citigroup and others. Big business funds the candidacies of their political flunkies and thereby purchase influence. When big businesses, through risky schemes and lying to investors, nearly destroy the economy and themselves, the influence they purchased is exercised, and the politicos unconditionally bail them out, ensure that no one is punished, then later quietly and methodically weaken the strong consumer protection regulations compelled to passage by public anger in the aftermath. Among the lessons of 2008 were that regardless of its misdeeds, big business is impervious to punishment or even intensive supervision, and that the politicians who depend on big business's big bank accounts to maintain their own privileged position will always save them. The brazenness with which the establishment rescued itself and abandoned everyone else roused the Occupy movement. Unfortunately, Occupy never successfully articulated specific goals or methods of achieving them, nor did a leader emerge who could shape the mass of restlessness into a movement with forward momentum, who could unite a disparate gathering of unhappy individuals into a cohesive group that could act for change. Lacking goals, central guidance, and therefore achievements, Occupy protesters left, even though their legitimate grievances remained. With even less group coherence, but which has remained more visible, is the Tea Party. Tea Party supporters are incited variously by real and perceived government excess, corruption, irresponsible and inept foreign policy, changing moral standards, and the illegal immigration of Hispanics and Latinos. Like Occupy adherents, Tea Party supporters feel alienated from the government that is supposed to represent them. Both groups are angry about the power of big business and their collusion with politicians, and about the big bank bailouts. Within the nativist segments of the Tea Party also resides racism, which, regardless of how limited its extent, taints the entire group. Tea Party advocates surely don't want to be judged by the conduct or beliefs of only a small number of their group, but neither do blacks, Jews, Hispanics, Catholics, gay people, or anyone else. Without clear objectives, paths to achieve them, or effective leaders to guide them, neither Occupy nor the Tea Party have fused into viable social movements that resemble recent successful ones. Therefore, to the extent that they can be considered defined groups, they are merely amalgamations of people who share similar complaints. While complaints can be the basis of a movement, they alone can't create and sustain one. Black Americans in the 1950s and 1960s had plenty of complaints, but the civil rights movement began when those complaints were joined to defined objectives and to forceful leadership. Every successful revolutionary movement included the elements of grievances, objectives, methods to achieve them, and leadership. Complaining isn't enough. For a new American revolution to foment, we need the same ingredients. Otherwise, any movement for radical change will share the fate of the Tea Party and of Occupy. Our grievances are presented here, and we live them every day. We've portrayed the kind of leader who can guide us. We've described a peaceful, socially and economically just, post-revolutionary America that we want and we deserve. So, what specific remedies will help us achieve that? We need a new constitution. An 18th century document designed for a rural nation of 4 million, dispersed among 13 small seaboard states, is inadequate to the needs of a 21st century urban international power of more than 300 million people. That people should update their frame of government to adapt to contemporary needs is common sense. If the framers themselves thought that old forms of government ought to manage new realities, then they wouldn't have introduced the Constitution. Today's Americans are alienated from their government because the government is unresponsive to them. That is partially due to the limitations of the Constitution, which was crafted for a nation with more than 75 times fewer people. It's time for an upgrade. The new Constitution should include term limits for all elected officials, perhaps 6 years for presidents, 6 years for senators, and 3 years for representatives. State and local governments can mirror that. The benefits of new people, fresh perspectives, and greater access to office far outweigh the so-called benefits of expertise, experience, and seniority. The proof for that is obvious. All of the expertise, experience, and seniority of our current perpetual office holders have produced the corrupt and disintegrating country we have right now. Thanks, but we can do better. Term limits also mean that politicians won't need to begin campaigning for re-election as soon as they're sworn in, which is of course what happens today. Instead, because a consecutive term isn't possible, public officials can actually focus on public business, not on fundraising. Yes, term limits mean abridging voters' ability to elect whomever they want, but that ability has not been exercised wisely, as is demonstrated by the current composition of our government and its contemptible conduct. It's time to try something different, since what we're doing now isn't working. Besides, while there should be a bar to non-consecutive terms, that doesn't mean an effective politician can never be elected to something again, even to the same office. Just not back to back into eternity, where they can serve the corporate masters who purchase their elections until only the grim reaper forces them from office. A new constitution should reduce the ratio of representatives in the House to constituents, meaning congressional districts should be smaller, or new states should be created. Whatever the method, the goal must be that each member of the House of Representatives should have a constituency of no more than 20,000 people. Today it's about 700,000. The smaller the proportion, the greater the voice of an individual voter, and the more possible it is that the will of that smaller constituency will be reflected in the conduct of the representative. In the same way that an individual student can be heard, can participate, and can have his or her needs addressed in a classroom of 10 instead of 100, so too can an individual citizen's needs be addressed in a district of 20,000 instead of 700,000. A government whose members have more contact with voters is a more responsive government. Right now, the government is totally unresponsive to the public, not only because it is dominated by corporate interests, but because its very structure presents obstacles. It's impossible for a single representative to know, let alone act on, the wishes of 700,000 people, or half of that, or 20% of that. A more responsive government is far more important than maintaining the current size of Congress or the boundaries of states. A new constitution should prohibit elected officials and high-ranking appointees from cashing in on their public service by subsequently becoming lobbyists. Today, when members of Congress, cabinet officials, and their powerful staffs leave office, they don't go home. They stay in Washington and sell their access and influence to corporations, who pay them to use their unique connections and knowledge to push the corporate agenda and to shape legislation favorable to it. This practice warps democracy and bends it in favor of big business and its minions. Despite Obama's campaign pledges, current regulations affecting the revolving door of lobbyists and public officials are weak and ineffectual. Let's make it both easy and effective. For those privileged to be elected by citizens to become public servants and to represent their views in government, and those who serve as staff, they cannot later sell that public privilege in the service of private interests. They'll have to find other work that doesn't pervert democracy through the gift of public service and public trust, being used later as a tool by corporate interests to subvert public interest. A new constitution should include public-financed elections. Instead of politicians having to denigrate themselves and their offices by passing their hat at $2,000 per plate fundraisers and of becoming trapped in our current system of political favors for donations, candidates should be funded by the voters. Today, the marionettes in government are controlled by strings of money attached to big business. By implementing public financing, politicians will depend on regular people for money, so that the public becomes the puppet master, finally. The Supreme Court has decided that money is speech. Obviously, whoever has the most money has the loudest voice. That's why politicians are listening only to banks, weapons manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, and insurance companies, and ignoring everyone else, because the volume of their money drowns out average citizens. Public financing of campaigns will restore the public's voice and compel politicians to listen. A new constitution should include the line item veto. This is a capability that permits the president to veto specific portions of a bill while signing the rest into law. Such a tool is necessary to mitigate congressional abuse of the legislative system. Congress likes to bury their rewards to their special interest paymasters into bills whose otherwise broad support will guarantee their passage. For example, the congressional delegation from New York may insert a tax loophole for big New York banks into a bill authorizing funds to repair a bridge in some other state. If voted on independently, the tax loophole would likely fail due to negative publicity. So they hide it in a more popular bill, knowing that the president won't veto the entire widely supported bill just to prevent passage of the bonus to big business. With the line item veto, a president can veto the tax loophole while approving the funds for bridge repair. Further, the corrupt legislator responsible for including the tax loophole would likely receive the negative recognition he or she deserves, which certainly doesn't happen now. Smuggling special interest favors into otherwise acceptable bills is standard operating procedure in Congress, not an exception. It's been the legislative hammer most used to smash our democracy. The Confederate government, not known for its progressive laws, nevertheless improved on the U.S. Constitution by including the line item veto in its Constitution. More recently, in the context of so-called Republican reforms of the mid-1990s, the line item veto was actually enacted into law in 1996. President Clinton was able to exercise it until the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional in 1998. A line item veto will establish a necessary check on Congress. It will give the president the power to resolve a congressionally created hostage crisis in which a good bill is held in the chains of special interest rewards and giveaways. The president can break those chains and sign into law the public interest portions of the bill and veto the rest. The line item veto can be a trowel used to repair the damage inflicted by that hammer of congressional corruption. A new constitution should include a single-payer healthcare system. A goal of any rich, industrialized country should be to ensure health care to all of its citizens. Right now, even with Obamacare, the United States doesn't. We're the only such country that doesn't. That's not because we can't afford it. It's because of the philosophical objections and the selfishness of powerful conservatives. Philosophically, they don't want it because it's socialistic. But so are Medicare and Medicaid. So are food stamps. So is unemployment compensation. So is welfare. So is Amtrak. But really, the same conservatives object to those too. But the true source of their opposition to a single-payer system is the aversion to it by the corporate interests in the pharmaceutical and insurance industries who pay for their elections. However, the health and welfare of poor Americans is more important than profits, and the laws of any country not governed by crooked corporate shills should reflect that. Single-payer works in other places, and it can work here. We wouldn't be the first to institute it, which means we can learn from any problems experienced by other countries and avoid them. Like with so much in modern America, there is no excuse to maintain a system that subordinates human welfare and dignity to the financial gain of a few. A new constitution should include a requirement for a balanced budget. Like every person in America, the government shouldn't be able to spend an infinite amount when its income is finite. Not only does our government do that, it spends very little on anything that matters to a lot of people. No one would object if all the money was spent on housing, health care, education, child care, or infrastructure. But the money is channeled to corporate subsidies, weapons manufacturers, foreign aid to dictatorships, and for secretly interfering in other people's countries. Our profligate spending has mired us in debt to other nations who are our creditors. Despite the naive and strident rhetoric No one should be afraid of China. China hasn't been continually at war for the last decade, nor starting wars of convenience based on false pretenses. But no country should be as indebted to another as the U.S. is to China, because it endows the creditor country with a certain measure of power and therefore control. An individual who is buried in debt is hardly independent because he or she is reliant on whomever gives him or her money. Identically, the United States cannot be considered truly independent since we absolutely depend on our next loan. This situation isn't due to a lack of money. America is the richest country in the world with the largest economy. Instead, it's because of non-existent spending limits and equally absent discipline and intelligence. Our government should be required to spend only the money it has and not a cent more. Doing so will not only mean true independence by breaking the shackles of our creditors, but will also free future generations from the crushing bills of their parents and grandparents. The truth is that America has plenty of money to establish and maintain a healthy, vigorous society without being in debt. With priorities based on broad human welfare principles, the only entities that will lose funding due to a balanced budget are those which should have never received funding. A new constitution should include a simple, progressive income tax. No more tax loopholes for big business. No more distinction between a salary and capital gains. No more offshore tax havens. Instead, the more money earned, the more taxes paid, period. If a company is based or operates in the U.S., it should be taxed according to its earnings the previous year, no exceptions. A person who earns $2 million a year should pay a higher tax rate than someone who earns $25,000 a year, no exceptions. In post-World War II America, the middle class expanded, the economy grew, income inequality was low, the concentration of wealth was minimal, and the top tax rate was 90%. As the tax rate on high incomes was reduced, so was the wealth of the middle class, so was the economy, and income and wealth inequality grew. A progressive tax helps to maintain a better society for everyone. And the purpose of a country, the purpose of people cooperating to form a state, isn't so that only a few people benefit while the rest languish. Otherwise, who needs a country? A new constitution should include lenient immigration laws. If decent, law-abiding people want to become Americans, let's let them. Immigration has always helped the United States and has never hurt it. Unfortunately, anti-immigration sentiment is as American as the Statue of Liberty that welcomes them. Perhaps more so, since the statue is French. But the fears of those opposed to immigration in the 1790s, 1840s, 1980s, 1890s, 1900s, 1920s, 1940s, and 1980s have never been founded, and today's aren't either. That most Americans are surely unfamiliar with those fears of earlier eras proves the point. Future Americans won't know of today's fears either, if America has a future. A new constitution should reduce the pervasiveness of firearm ownership. The headlines every night clearly demonstrate that Americans cannot be trusted with guns. Americans of earlier epochs could be, but we've degenerated. Until our culture again progresses beyond using violence as a first resort to settle disputes, the favorite tool for causing bloodshed should be unreachable. Opponents to gun control are naive demagogues whose lies or ignorance are somehow treated as valid views. The UK, Canada, Germany, Italy, France, Australia, and Japan, among others, strictly limit gun ownership. The result hasn't been a meek public oppressed by a tyrannical government or increased crime perpetrated by criminals who obtain firearms illegally. The result has been negligible deaths by gunfire, reduced crime, and an absence of mass shootings. Like with so much else, other countries have already successfully accomplished that which the corrupt, entrenched American establishment argues is impossible. But their beliefs are not just ludicrous and divorced from reality, they are lethal. Each year, more than 30,000 Americans are killed by guns. So, every 2 years, Americans self-inflict more deaths than the decade-long Vietnam War. America is by far the most violent industrialized country. Guns haven't created the violence that suffuses our society, but they permit the easy unleashing of it. Eliminating firearms won't make American society less violent, but it will make it much harder for deviants intent on violence to inflict it so quickly, effectively, and massively. Widespread gun ownership is just fine for societies that won't use guns to kill themselves. Right now, that's not America. If a disturbed person won't stop hitting his neighbor with a club, the true solution is to try to cure the mind of the assailant so that the urge to violence disappears. But that will take time and maybe it'll be impossible. Meanwhile, the neighbor is being beaten badly by that club. So until the assailant's mind is healed, it's absolutely right to stop the violence by immediately taking away the club. A new constitution should decentralize military authority. Recent American presidents have ignored the intended separation of war powers in the Constitution, believing that their judgment and character can be trusted better than the prudence of the Constitution's framers. The results have been fruitless wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq twice, and innumerable military actions around the world, many of which are concealed from the American public. While the Constitution indeed designates the President as Commander-in-Chief of the military, modern presidents have abused that authority by engaging in practically personal warfare and lying to the American public to win consent. Future American presidents must not be entrusted with such vast and consequential authority. Fast communication technology can allow more people to be involved in military decisions without slowing responses. Regardless of how the system is changed, the one requirement must be that ultimate military authority cannot belong to only one person. That feature of our Constitution and the men who have misused it are responsible for America's precarious and declining global position and for profound injuries to our society. As recent research has demonstrated, groups always make wiser choices than individuals. That wisdom is especially needed in matters of war and peace. The remedies described are only a start, not a finish, but pursued as objectives and implemented, they can accomplish the main goal of a new American Revolution, to restore the truly representative government that is our birthright. America once had a responsive government, one that reflected the will of its citizens, but we don't now. It was stolen from us by corporate greed and political avarice. By not resisting, by not rebelling, we are complicit in that theft. The American tradition abounds with individuals and groups who didn't just surrender their freedoms and their rights, but who struggled to gain and to retain them. From the original American revolutionaries to the suffragettes, to the reformers of the Progressive Era, to the Black Civil Rights Movement, to today's movement for legal recognition of the equality of LGBT people. Should we stain a proud American tradition of fighting for a better life with our pathetic apathy and indifference? Should we meekly submit to corporate power and allow ourselves to become merely consumers and our human qualities just commodities? It's time for each of us to remember the people of our collective past who fought for their future, which is us, and to be ignited by their example. We must say, I am George Washington, I am John Adams, I am Patrick Henry, I am Benjamin Franklin. But not only them. We must also say, I am Mum Bet, I am Nat Turner, I am Sojourner Truth, I am Susan B. Anthony, I am Frederick Douglass, I am Sitting Bull, I am Eugene V. Debs, I am Margaret Sanger, I am W.E.B. Du Bois, I am Cesar Chavez, I am Martin Luther King Jr., I am Malcolm X. Our forebears saved us from the British Empire, saved us from the influence of slavery, saved us from Jim Crow segregation, saved Europe from the Kaiser, and saved the world from Hitler and Tojo, all so that we can pursue life, liberty, and happiness. All that struggle, all that blood, all those tears over all those years, sacrificing for us, just so that we can now bow down to some smarmy hack politicians and craven hucksters in business suits? Fuck that. We fight. Now.